Hello, and welcome to watching me take something that's definitely not a snail and try and see if I can turn it into a snail. Today I'm going to be making a Cookie Monster snail. Now, full disclosure, I have made a Cookie Monster snail in the past, but I'm taking an entirely different approach this time and trying out some new techniques. Alright, well, let's get started. I'm going to just be using original Sculpey for this guy. I could use Super Sculpey like I did in my last video, or any other polymer clay really, but since this guy's going to get totally covered up with fur, I'm going to just use the original Sculpey and save the Super Sculpey for a project that really needs it. Now, this was a new block of clay, so I'm going to just take a quick minute here to work it and get it softened up so that it is ready to go when we're ready to sculpt. So to make Cookie Monster fluffy, I have this sample piece of like a faux fur fabric. It's about the closest color I could find to Cookie Monster blue. And then I've also chosen this shell to go along with it, mostly just because I think the colors really complement each other well. The shell has this kind of orange tint to it that I think looks really nice. I also could have painted the shell or flocked the shell, but I decided to just leave it. To prep the shell for being attached to the body, I'm going to use this oven baked clay adhesive. It's important that I use this and not liquid polymer clay. They're easy to get confused. The bottles look pretty similar. Store employees get them mixed up. I get them mixed up. We want the adhesive. After pouring some adhesive down into the shell, I'm going to start shoving clay down in there. The adhesive will help to let the clay reach down into the further recesses of the shell, as well as give the clay that I add a bit more grip inside of that otherwise really smoothly textured inside of that shell. I'm going to fill it as full as possible, trying to avoid air bubbles as much as I can. But I want to get it as completely filled as I possibly can squeeze in there, and then have some extra clay on the outside, which will make blending it into the body a little bit easier. Now you'll notice on this shell this seam that's down here at the bottom. That's because this shell used to be a lot bigger. I really liked the color of the shell, like I said, so I altered it to make it smaller, just kind of cutting away some of this extra growth that was on the end of the shell here. And of course this had to be done with lots of good ventilation and proper equipment, because inhaling shell dust is never a good thing. I'm gonna roll my clay out into this sort of tapered snake and start figuring out my posing. Now I know that I want him to be holding a cookie jar and have a lot of cookies, so I'm gonna try to keep his tail in a sort of holding position as much as I can. And then we need to start thinking about eye stalk support. Now, I'm going to use this electric fence wire because I always do, and it's wonderful and cheap and sturdy and makes great armature wire. I need 2 equally sized pieces of wire, one for each of his eye stalks. Now, Cookie Monster's eyes are a pretty iconic part of him, so in an effort to try to keep them as similar as possible to the actual Muppet, I'm going to make his eye stalks pretty short, but I still want to have those wires inside just for the added structure and stability. The rest of the wire is going to get coiled up on either side to make the kind of anchor between the shell and the body. I haven't dropped very many snails, but I imagine this probably helps quite a bit with keeping the shell from just flying off the back end of a snail if it were ever to be dropped. So kind of this S shape. One end is going to get shoved down into the shell, and the other end is going to get shoved into the snail's body. I realized I didn't leave myself quite enough excess clay to work with on the outside of this shell, but it was an easy fix. I just added a little bit more clay to the bottom. That way I'd have a good amount to work with for blending this into the body really well. Once I've got that shell pretty much where I want it, I'm going to take this ball tool. I've got a little one on one end and a teeny one on the other end. And this just is a really good tool for kind of aggressively moving the clay around, which right now I need to just kind of make sure that everything gets smooshed up and mixed together really well. That way this joint won't have any cracks or separations or issues once it's baked. Then I'm going to use my fingers to kind of further smooth out what I was able to do with the ball tool. Once I'm satisfied with that, I'm going to take my handy dandy silicone brush tipped tool. These are usually marketed as a nail art tool, but I really love them for reaching down into these little cracks and crevices. They're really great also for smoothing out areas that are kind of awkwardly shaped for like my fingers or something else to get into. Just kind of roll it around. And now I don't need to worry too much about making sure that these areas are like super smooth and perfect, because this whole snail is going to get covered up with fur anyway. But my main focus is just on the structural integrity of these areas and making sure that they are blended to where they're not going to, cause me any problems later on. Once I got to a point where I was pretty content with that, I started working on refining his posing, and I decided he needed to be a little bit shorter, a little bit less long, and a little bit bigger around the middle. Now, since we are adding that fur fabric onto the outside of this, it's very important to try and account for that extra thickness. So I want to try and keep him ever so slightly smaller than I would actually want for him to be. That way, once I have that added thickness of the fabric and the fur that's attached to the fabric, he'll be just the size that I want him. And shape. Good Cookie Monster shape. For his head shape, I'm going to add this kind of a half circle to the top here. He's not going to have a lower jaw since he's a snail, but I have made a Cookie Monster in the past that did have a lower jaw. I think I ended up liking this one more, actually, just because he's a little bit more snail-like. This craft blade I'm going to use to cut his upper jaw to give it a real crisp, hard edge. To look a little bit more, like his Muppet counterpart. And then once I have that wedge shape cut out, I'm going to do a lot of blending and sort of finessing of his pose to really get him exactly where I want him. Because the more I can keep him refined as I'm working, the less cleanup I will have to do towards the end. Once his head is pretty much where I want it, I'm going to take those two wire pieces for his eye stalks and start figuring out where I want them positioned. I'm going to use that clay adhesive once again. I like to keep a bunch of it in this little box. It might sound a little bit weird, but it's super hard to squeeze out of the bottle because it's so thick, and this keeps the dust off, and I can just dip things into it when I need a light coating of clay adhesive like on these eye stalks. I want to make sure that this wire is pretty well coated in the adhesive so that the clay has a good surface to really stick to. And after that, I will reattach the eye and start blending the clay of the eye stalk into the clay of his head. Now with the eye stalks, in much the same way that I need to keep the body slightly smaller to account for the thickness of the fabric, I also need to keep the eye stalks closer to what I actually want their finished size to be, because I'm not going to be adding that fabric to the eye stalks themselves. It would just be a bit too cumbersome and difficult to deal with. Instead, I'm going to be using a flocking method on his eyes. That way I can still have them be fuzzy, but it'll be a much shorter fur, as well as, not as kind of thick and bushy and lush as I want the rest of his body to be. I did have a small mishap when adding on his second eye. I pushed a little bit too hard on the clay itself, and you can see the end of the wire stuck out a little bit here. Super easy fix. I'm going to just take one of my tools and push that wire further deep down into the eye stalk before closing that clay back up around it. Reshape it a little bit. It's totally good to go. After his eye stalks are on, it's time to give him some eyeballs. Now, I know in my last video I showed you guys these glass boiling stones. These are what I usually use for eyes. I have lots of different sizes of them, but I didn't have quite the size I wanted. So I decided to make his eyeballs out of clay. I just rolled out a little ball of the same clay, and then I'm going to cut it in half with this craft blade to give it a flat back, just to make shaping and positioning a little bit easier. Now obviously this squished them quite a bit, but I can easily fix this if I just take my finger to support that flat back part to keep it flat, and then I'm going to use my other fingers and kind of slowly rotate as I pinch in order to shape this back as close to a circle as I can reasonably get. Once I'm happy with the shape of it, all I need to do is stick it onto the eye stalk. Since the eyeball and the eye stalk are both unbaked raw clay, they'll adhere to each other just fine without the clay adhesive. After fiddling with the eyeballs for what felt like an eternity, he is finally ready to go in the oven. Now that he's nice and stiff, I can give him a quick little base coat with this acrylic paint. I'm going to choose a color that's maybe a shade darker than what I'm hoping for his final color to be. And the purpose of this is to kind of preemptively cover any areas that are on an edge or likely to be on a seam of the fabric. That way, if something does show through, it's not going to be the bright white of the clay. It's going to be a blue that's pretty close to that color anyway, so it'll make hiding and fixing those spots a lot easier. I'm also not going to totally coat him in blue paint because when I go to add the fur on, adhering that fur fabric to the raw clay is going to be such a stronger bond than if I'm adhering it to a layer of acrylic paint. Then while Cookie Monster is drying, I'm going to make some chocolatey chunk cookies for him. This is Sculpey 3 clay that comes in this color. It's a really nice kind of chocolatey brown color. I'm going to take this clay and roll it and smush it out flat. I'm then going to bake it and take that hardened little piece of clay and break it into a bunch of little pieces to make some chocolate chunks. Doing it this way will let the chunks in our final cookies retain more of their definition and look, just a little more chunky. For the cookies themselves, I'm going to go back to this white original Sculpey clay, and I'm going to start rolling off these little balls of clay that are approximately the same shape and size, but I don't want any of them to be perfect circles or to be exactly the same size because I'm going for a sort of more realistic, homemade looking cookie. Once I have as many cookies as I want, I'm going to start patting them out flat onto this sheet and adding their chocolatey chunks. When I'm shaping the cookies, I wanted to keep them a little more dome shaped, so I'm pressing more around the edge of the cookie than the center. And to add the chocolate chunks, I'm just dipping my finger in and then pressing them into the surface of the clay. Now, baking these cookies in the oven isn't going to brown them, but I can use my chalk pastels to make that happen before I bake them. These are the same pastels that I used in my last video. Again, I just shaved them down into a really fine powder, and I have this kind of mustard yellow and burnt ochre brown that I really like using for baked items. Any small makeup brush will do, and I just need to pack the pigment into the outer layer of the clay as consistently and deeply as I can. In applying it this way, the more pressure I use, the more I can use the texture of this brush to my advantage as well. And once that yellow is applied, I can take the brown and go around the edges to really crisp up and make this cookie look like it really was baked in the oven. Then we got to do the same for all the other cookies. Don't forget to do the bottoms because some of those are going to show as well, and then they can finally go in the oven. While those cookies are baking in the oven, I'm going to get started on a cookie jar. Just that same original Sculpey clay. And before I go any further, I'm going to check my fit because I have to make sure again that I account for the thickness of the fur, as well as in this instance, I'm going to be putting a layer of colored clay on the outside to color it. So I'm going to take off some excess, check that, and I have a lot more wiggle room to work with now, so it's a much better fit. I want to make sure that the top and bottom of this jar are pretty flat, and I'm going to use just a little piece of black clay to make the opening or the mouth of my cookie jar. I rolled out a piece of yellow clay that I'm going to use to color this pot and make it look nice and smooth on the outside. I'm going to just very carefully wrap this around. It's kind of an odd shape to cover, but luckily clay is very malleable, so I can kind of pinch and pull and squish it where I need it to go. I'm going to cut off these edges to make a nice seam where I can more easily blend things together, and cut off the excess on the bottom here. To cover that lovely bald spot on the bottom of our cookie jar, I'm going to take some more of that same yellow clay and punch a circle out of it that I can use to make a lovely base or kind of foot to our jar. For the top edge of the jar, I rolled out a little snake that I put on the top of the jar and just kind of carefully went around the edge of that black hole spot that we made in the top. Once I was content with how everything was blended and shaped, it was time to stick the jar in the oven. Now that it's all baked, we can paint with this super tiny nail art paintbrush. I'm going to start working on painting the lettering on the outside of our cookie jar. The best advice I can give for this kind of tiny letter painting is to go slow, take your time, make sure you've eaten that day so your hands aren't shaky, and be willing to give yourself breaks on occasion so that your poor eyeballs don't get strained and give you a headache. Now that the painting is done, we let it dry. And when it's dry, we start adding our cookies to the cookie jar. Now that we're all done baking these pieces and they won't be going back in the oven, I can just use this super glue to attach the cookies to the jar. This will just make my life a little bit easier and make attaching these cookies go a little bit quicker than if I were to use the clay adhesive and have to bake them again. Plus they wouldn't be super stable right away and it could get a bit precarious in the oven. So after I checked the fit of some cookies, I decided I wanted one a little bit sticking out, so I cut the bottom half off, and once it's in place, you really can't tell that it's just a half a cookie. So now that I like where those are going to go, I can apply my super glue and place them for real. And now we have our cookie jar. Now here's where things get a little hairy. On the underside of this fabric, you can kind of see it's almost like a mesh material that the fur is like punched through. So in order to cut this more easily, I'm going to need to take my needle tool and part the hair where I plan to cut. If I didn't do this and just chomped down on top of it, the hair on the bottom end closer to where I cut would be way short compared to the hair on the top side of the fur, if that makes any sense. So to keep the hair all one length, I'm going to part it and then cut. Now, even with doing this, there's going to be some loose hairs around the edges, so I want to make sure that I pull as many of those out as possible just to try and keep the mess as much to a minimum as I can. Toothpicks are going to be super handy for pressing the hair into place, and before I apply any glue, I'm going to double check that I can line up my edge of the fabric to where I need it, and that it is going to wrap around to cover the area that I need it to cover. I can use my finger to kind of mark where I need to trim this fabric just so that I can get all of this excess out of my way so it's not flopping around on me while I'm trying to glue it on. I will inevitably also have to trim the fabric after it is applied, but this will just make my life a little easier in the meantime. I'm going to use that same super glue to adhere the fabric. I'm going to use a toothpick to really make sure that I press that fabric firmly into the glue. The glue will seep through that kind of mesh backing that this fabric has and get all over my fingers. It's going to happen no matter what. It's inevitable. But at least using the wooden toothpicks will help to kind of keep that to more of a minimum. Once that's nice and secure, I can just take my scissors and trim the edge, and then go back in with my glue to really make sure that both the edge and that corner there are glued down. After that, I can make my way up the rest of his body, making sure that I keep the fur going in the proper direction down towards the tip of his tail. Checking my edges, cutting new pieces as I need them, and just kind of working through it. Once I start to get towards the back of him here, the direction of the fur will change a little bit. And also around the edges of the fabric itself, I'm going to start using the glue and pulling those hair fibers down to kind of cover those seams with the fur itself. Some of the pieces ended up being kind of weirdly shaped, but as long as I keep the flow of the fur consistent, it's pretty easy to cover up those seams later. In general, it's best to try and have as few seams as possible and use as few pieces of fabric as possible, but I found that in trying to kind of capture the right flow of hair direction for this guy, I ended up having to have a lot more seams than I would have liked to. Once all the hair is attached and all the seams have been checked, your fluffy, hairy cookie dog is ready for a haircut. This is going to be messy no matter what, but at least this tray will help to catch some of the hair that falls. First thing I'm going to do is try and make sure that I get the hair sort of combed out so that nothing's bunched up or bundled up. Everything's kind of free-flowing in the direction that it's going to be going anyway. And then I can start trimming. I've found that it's best to trim off a little bit of hair at a time rather than trying to jump to the length that I think will be the most desirable, for a few different reasons. Primarily because it's easier to take more away than it is to try and add back on, and also because I can use the little tiny trimmings later on for flocking the areas like the eyes, or if there do end up being any weird seam areas that need a little fill in. As I'm going, I pull the hair out from the body so that I can better see if there's any that I'm missing, because my goal is to try and keep all of these hairs pretty consistently the same length. As I get more towards the end of the trimming, I try and keep as many of the cuts and snips as small as possible and keep those separated out from the longer bits, because this material is going to be the best for the flocking that I'm going to have to do later. I might even also take my scissors and kind of trim them up just to try and make them as fine as possible. Now I do also have flocking that I bought pre-made, and it's super consistently the same like length and very fine and powdery and wonderful, but it's not quite the shade that I needed. So in this instance, since I already have the fur, I figure it's easier to just have a perfect color match and kind of make my own. When I'm ready to apply the flocking, I'm going to just use some watered down acrylic paint, that same dark blue that I used earlier. And I'm going to paint the area that I want to apply the flocking to, including down onto the fur a little bit, just so that I can cover up that kind of transitional area from the clay to the fur as well. Then I'm going to take that chopped up hair and just kind of smush it into the paint so that it sticks to the surface of the eye stalk. I'm going to make sure that I cram it on as densely as possible, touching as much of the hair to the wet surface of the paint, especially in the kind of in-between crevice between his two eye stalks. Any big super loose chunks I can go ahead and pull off, but the rest of it's going to stay until it's totally dry, and then I can dust the loose bits off and apply more if there's any bare spots. I do the same on any edges that are showing that kind of bug me, like this white edge here where you can kind of see that mesh part of the fabric sticking out. Just went over it again with that watered down acrylic paint and then smushed the loose little fur bits into the wet paint to kind of stick it on. I actually ended up having to do this a lot more than I generally do. The sort of mesh backing that's on this fabric was just such a way lighter color than the fur itself. Like it was pretty much just white, and it showed through a lot more than I wanted it to, especially on some of these edges, and you can kind of see in like his tail, pretty much anywhere that I had an edge to that fabric or one of the sections of fabric that I added, I had to then go back and find that edge and hide it. You can see what I mean here on his kind of cheek area where this piece that made up his upper lip kind of terminated in a really awkward way. I just used some more of that acrylic paint to cover that up and then shoved a bunch of flocking down on that wet paint to adhere it and really fill in those areas that needed to be hidden. Now, I had already decided at this point that I was going to be painting his fur at least to some degree because I realized that the fur wasn't quite as close a match to the right color as I had thought it was going to be. But then I also ended up having all of these edges that needed to be covered because of that underlying backing to this fur fabric. It was so much lighter than the color of the fur itself that every seam that I had to be fixed and color corrected. Not to mention, I must have not let the underside of this black area on his belly dry 100% of the way before I glued the fur on, because I got this weird frosty haze from the super glue on the edges, but at least a little bit of paint took care of it pretty easy. After all that hair trimming, it is entirely necessary to thoroughly clean the entire work area, because those little bits of hair will come back to haunt you for months. Now that most of the hair trimming is done, I can start working on hair styling using a little bit of this light blue acrylic paint. I'm going to add a little bit of water to it just so that it has a little bit more movement and can seep down into those smaller areas more easily. I will work my way from the mouth back down to the tail this time and just put in a bunch of that acrylic paint in a little section at a time and use my finger to spread it around and sort of position the hairs in the direction that I want them to go. As I'm working, I'm going to constantly look for hairs that are out of place or for any that are a little bit longer than their friends, just so that we can keep things, looking spiffy. I also ended up using this wire brush quite a bit to help me kind of comb the hair into place. It worked really well for making sure that each of the individual hairs were pretty well saturated with the watered down paint. From there, I worked my way down the rest of the body using my finger to kind of spread the paint around and highlight certain areas, as well as to add coverage to other areas and kind of pose the fur. Since the acrylic paint is watered down, it holds it in place while not keeping it like super bogged down and like crunchy after it's dried. So it still has a softer, kind of fluffy quality to it while still being held in place where I need it to be. This method of painting the fur does work really well, but it's also very messy. So there was some touch up to do on his eyeballs, as well as on the black sections of his kind of tummy and underbelly. While that's drying, I'm going to take one of these cookies from earlier and crunch it up into some crumbly crumbs to make, a little bit of Cookie Monster mess. Very carefully with this craft blade, I'm going to smash this cookie to bits, and then because the inside is white and I didn't really have the foresight to think about this part, I'm going to just add a little bit of water to that same pastel powder that I used earlier, and then paint the white insides of these cookies just so that they have some coloration on them. Even though it's not going to be super noticeable, if I left it bright white, it would be super noticeable. Now back to the monster himself. I'm going to be gluing some of those cookies to the actual fur of him. So I did a quick little tester of some super glue, which I felt held pretty well but didn't really penetrate down into the fur the way I would have liked. And I also tried some contact adhesive, which seemed to have a much more firm and strong bond. So that's what I decided to go with. So I'll be using this Gorilla Clear Grip glue. It's very similar to E6000 glue. Safely use, of course. Be careful of fumes and getting it on your skin. But our cookie jar is going to go somewhere right here in his tail. And so I just wanted to kind of pick up some fur so that there would be some kind of poking out on the outside, but I found one that's a little longer than I wanted. So we got to do a quick little trim before we check our cookie jar fit. Once I'm happy with the positioning and the amount of fur that I have to kind of come up along the side of it, I'm going to glue it into place. Careful to check where my points of contact are so that I know where to apply the glue. And I'm just going to take a little bit of that Gorilla Glue on the end of this toothpick and spread it around in those areas where I know I'm going to need it. I'm going to also work some glue into those points of contact on the fur itself so that I can make sure that that glue is really firmly mixed in so it'll have a good hold. We can't have Cookie Monster losing his cookies. Do a quick little fluff up of his fur with this needle tool so that I make sure I don't get any glue on my fingers, and then he'll be good to sit and cure. In the meantime, I can start figuring out the positioning of my loose cookies and start gluing them on with the same method as well. For the next portion of the project, I'm going to be using this Mr. Resin brand UV resin. This is the kind that I've had the best luck with and been using the longest. But I will say this particular batch that's in this bottle must have gotten flashed with light for like a hot second or something, because it's just slightly thicker than normal. But it works just fine. I added some light blue glitter and a little bit of this pearlescent powder to it as well, just to kind of give it a little extra Cookie Monster magic. Now that that's nice and mixed up, I can do a quick, rough layer on the bottom of the snail. After I have this kind of rough resin layer applied, I can take Cookie Monster and set him down on this silicone mat. And when I pull him back up, I'll get a pretty good footprint so that I know where his slime trail base needs to be. That way I can build it up ahead of time to make sure that it is both the proper shape to cover everything and the proper size so that I don't get any air bubbles trapped underneath him, and so that I have the space to account for the cookies that are going to be sitting around the edge as well. Once I pretty much have the shape and size I need, I can stick him back down on top of it and start making sure that I have room for the cookies so that they're held in place as well. Once everything's placed, I can take my fancy dancy nail lamp. Please don't look at how dirty the buttons are. You can really tell which one I use the most. And he's going to get blasted underneath here for quite some time. He's a little bit too tall to fit underneath, so he's going to go in sideways, and every couple of minutes or so I'm going to rotate him just to try and make sure that I get every possible angle on him as cured as possible before I remove him from this silicone base that he's currently on. Once I'm confident that the upper layer of the UV resin has cured, I'm going to flip him over and blast the underside of him as well, just to make sure that when I take that silicone piece off, he comes off nice and clean and I don't have an ooey gooey mess. Now, I did notice that the amount of glitter that I put into the slime really obscured my artist mark, and I wanted to make sure that it was more visible, so I decided to paint on a new one. I used this metallic blue and just painted it back on. Now that painting will need to be sealed in somehow, and you'll notice the bottom of this also isn't perfectly smooth. There's a lot of little imperfections just because of the way that it cured. So in order to kind of take care of both of those things at once, I'm going to use a layer of just plain clear UV resin over the bottom just to seal all that in and give it more of a smooth finish so that it looks a little bit more gloopy rather than having that hard flat bottom. Once that base has been cured, I'm going to start working on his belly and covering that in a nice layer of resin as well, and adding in some cookie crumbs so it looks like he just gobbled down a bunch of cookies. As I do this, I'm going to make sure that those cookie pieces are fully covered in UV resin so that they're encapsulated and held in place and also kind of protected in place. Then using that same pastel powder from earlier, I'm going to just put some little dots of the powder in the resin. That way it's kind of like more fine grain cookie crumbs mixed within the slime as well. Then after that's all cured up, I can start working on sealing the other parts of the sculpture using my water-based polyacrylic sealant. This just helps to make sure that the pastel powders aren't going to rub off, as well as give a little extra protection against dings and scratches, but it also really makes the colors pop quite a bit more, kind of adds a little bit more moisture to that pastel and really makes it pop. Last but not least, he needs his eyes, so I'm gonna just take a little acrylic paint and very carefully mark out his pupils here on his eyeballs. I thought about trying to figure out giving him actual googly eyes, but decided that I'd rather have them stuck in the position that I would most want them to be viewed at, rather than trying to have googly eyes that were just looking down most of the time. To give his eyes a nice glossy shine, as well as to protect them, after the paint is dry, I'm going to apply a thin layer of this UV resin and make sure that it is as consistent of a layer as possible, and try and keep things as round and domed as possible. This can be a little bit tricky when the resin wants to kind of drip and run in certain directions, so there's a lot of changing position and trying to kind of hold things so that they won't shift. I'm gonna blast that eyeball under the UV light and rotate as I let him cure, just to again try and help keep that UV resin from running away on me. After trimming up a few more loose hairs, sealing his other eyeball, and checking the edges for any rough spots, as well as just giving him a good once-over to make sure I didn't miss anything, I felt like he was finally ready to go, and took him to the light box. And here he is. I'm actually really proud of how he ended up turning out. I think it's a big improvement from the first time that I made Cookie Monster, even though of course the original one will always have a special place in my heart. But I love the way that the cookie crumbs coming down the front of him turned out, and I actually ended up really liking the color variation I got in his fur. I also think the lettering I did on this cookie jar is some of the cleanest I have done yet. Thank you guys so much for hanging out and watching my process for making this guy. If you have any questions, any comments, any suggestions, I'm always happy to help and looking to improve. Thank you so much for watching this video, and remember, you're awesome.